Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this Decarbonisation Masterclass. This workshop is a part of a series of webinars, training sessions, and in-person events that we run regularly as one of the services that we provide for businesses. I'm hoping that you have given the greetings and some description about the Decerna in the breakout rooms. But generally at Decerna, we provide a wide range of services that you need to plan, design, and implement your decarbonization strategies. We also developed recently an online tool by which you can calculate and report your carbon emissions and generate the CRPs, which is needed for future trades in the UK. And we offer free access to some eligible companies. Just to please do check online our website, or if you are from the Tees Valley region, you can also check online the Tees Valley Combined Authority website for more information, and do not hesitate to get in touch with one of us for any queries that you need. A little bit about myself. I'm Mo. I'm a senior sustainability engineer at Decerna. And today with me is also Phil, who is the head of ERS group at Decerna, where we do all sorts of technical and strategic consultancy, as well as renewables and energy storage system developments. Also, we have Helen here, which is the organizer and the manager of this session, is our business development manager, and who will be in reach during and after this session to help you with any queries, or if you require any support with the registration or our services. Just before starting off, please note that this session will be recorded for our archive and future references, and also slides will be available. Slides will be available for you after the session. Okay, so let's start off. Here is a timetable of the program today. We start off with the introduction of some of the main principles and the definitions that we all need to understand before we start our net zero journey. And then we also provide the very first steps to start the journey. For example, what data you need to collect, where to collect it from, and what to pay attention to. Then we go to the quick wins, which are basically some straightforward measures and interventions which can be quickly implemented, mostly with low cost or no cost, to improve the energy efficiency and performance of your businesses. And we continue with the second part of the quick wins after a short break at around 11, and we introduce some renewables and new technologies if you want to go further in your net zero journey and put some more effort and investment in that. Then we will have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session, when you can ask your questions and bring up even some topics bespoke to your businesses. But in the meantime, please feel free to use the chat function to ask your comments, questions, or add any comments, and we'll try to pick them up after each section, or at the end of the masterclass. At the end of this session, we expect to leave you with a general understanding of net zero. What does it mean? What are the national targets? What are how does it relate to you and your businesses, and why it matters? And then we touch on some basic energy evaluations and audits that you can do on your premises to find the major gaps and improvement opportunities within your business. And also, you'll also have a handful of ideas and information to improve the energy efficiency and environmental performance of your company, which you can just prioritize based on your business demands and features, and start your decarbonization journey. Also, we will give a chance to discuss some of the issues, troubles that you have encountered within your business at the end of the session. So let's start with some introduction. Hopefully by now everyone is aware of the impact we are all having on the global environment and climate change, and the emergency that we need to tackle it. This is mostly the effect of greenhouse gas emissions. We call it the GHGs, mostly carbon dioxide that we generate from fossil fuel combustion in our industrial processes, in transportation, in agriculture, in deforestation, and so on. So this graph shows how GHG emissions over the last century has steeply rised from around second industrial revolution at around 1850, a constant growth of emissions due to mass production using electric energy has emerged. But starting from the third industrial revolution from 1970s, when we saw the revolution of IT services and automation in manufacturing, emissions began to rise more steeply to reach at the all-time high of around 37 gigaton in 2022. Businesses generally play a big part in this, and can prevent or at least decelerate the climate change, which apart from the carbon reduction impact and the environmental impact of it, it creates some side financial opportunities and other opportunities for your business and company, and we will discuss them in the next slides. But why this should matter and why we should care about this? First and foremost, to prevent the effect of global warming, and we know all that the Earth has been heating up over the last century, with 2023 has been the hottest year of history, with almost 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial level. But as you can see in the graph, it's constantly the average temperature is increasing. This is the latest update is August 2023, but we just last week had a new high record as well. So when it comes to climate change and the global warming, every very single half a degree even matters. And one might think that, I mean, it's okay, it's only 1 degree Celsius. I personally appreciate it. Here in Newcastle, it means a longer summer maybe, but it doesn't work like that. The fact is that the global warming, even in very small temperature rises in a broad global scale, can have devastating results, because it directly increases the risk of sea level rise, wildfires, extreme weather impacts, species extinction, pandemics, drought, food insecurity, climate migration, and so many other problems in a global scale. And all of these consequences are sort of interconnected. Just focusing on the wildfires, for example, only in 2023, I was reading a report that nearly 23 million acres were burned in wildfires. Let's put it into more sensible figures. That's equal to 16 football pitches every minute. That's the land that we burned last year in 2023, and that means the destruction of land, food resources, biodiversity, and so on. And it's surprising always for me to see that if you check it online, this website, which is the NASA wildfires the real-time wildfires map. It's always surprising. I had this photo just for this morning, and these red dots are the spots in the planet that currently, just as we speak, are burning. And if you zoom in just in Europe, as we are in the middle of a winter, you can see lots of spots also in fire, even in Europe. So that's a real emergency that we all need to really concern about it. But what's the role of UK businesses here? SMEs generally, or MSMEs, as we recently call them, micro, small, and medium enterprises, comprise of 90% and 99% of UK businesses, and they are accounting for 61% of UK employment. These 5.5 million businesses around the UK often have relatively small emission footprint at the individual level, but they collectively account for around half of the emission release from the total UK businesses. So the Climate Change Act binds the UK to reach net zero emissions by 2050 as a part of commitment to 2015 Paris Agreement to keep the temperature rises below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. But we also have some midterm targets. For example, we have to reduce the carbon emissions by 78% by 2035. Also, we are committed to 100% decarbonize the power system by 2035. We also need to phase out fossil fuel cars by 2030 or 2035. It was due to be on 2035, but Rishi Sunak pushed it back to 2035, and also 80 to 100% phase out of installation of new gas boilers by 2035. These are the midterm targets and commitments in the UK, and businesses are the important part of that journey, and they have to adapt to new regulations. And hopefully by end of this session you will have some information you need to what you need to really decide and what options are available in the market for you to start this journey. Okay, let's start with some of the main principles that we all need to understand before be able to plan and design our decarbonization plans. The first one and the most probably important one is the emission scopes, which are the standardized way of categorizing greenhouse gas emissions based on their source, which can this categorization helps us to account for all emissions, avoid double counting, and also identify the biggest lags and the biggest opportunities within your business. But very brief here, scope 1 are the direct emissions from the sources owned by the company. Scope 2 are emissions, indirect emissions from the purchased energy that you consume in your premises, and scope 3 is all indirect emissions from the company's operation phase. So today, the measures that we're gonna discuss today mainly affect the scope 1 and 2 emissions. Again, as we touched on that, scope 1 covers the emissions from sources that your organization owns or directly controls. For example, some of the most obvious examples are the gas or oil that you're burning in your boilers, the company vehicles that are not electric, the leaks from the refrigeration system, and all the refrigerants which are used in the in the equipment of your company, and also the process emissions such as factory fumes and chemicals, and lastly the emissions from agriculture activities. If you have the scope 2 emissions are GHG emissions associated with the purchase energy for your company. For most of the SMEs, the scope 2 is just the electricity you buy from the grid, but you might have some heating from the heat networks that goes under the scope 2 emissions, or you might have some purchased steam for your industrial processes. And finally, scope 3 are all indirect emissions associated with the upstream and downstream activities of your company's value chain. Basically, all other indirect emissions which are not included in scope 2 can be categorized under the scope 3, which can be for different businesses, which can vary between 50 even to 70-80% of the company's emissions. Some examples are the business travels on vehicles not owned by the company, the staff commuting emissions from purchased goods, services, for example, the raw materials, papers, coffee, IT device, anything that you buy for your company, transportation of these goods, and also all emissions from own assets of the company. For example, if you have any investment properties, if you have any acquisitions, if you have any other lending activities, they also need to take into account within the emission calculation of your company, and also the emissions related to waste management and disposal. But what does net zero means? Net zero is actually the next fundamental principle that we need to comprehend here. Net zero refers to a state in which the greenhouse gas going into atmosphere are balanced by the emission removals from the atmosphere. So achieving this balance between the emissions that we generate and the emissions we remove or save from the atmosphere, we call it net zero. It can be achieved through the combination of two main strategies. One is reducing the emissions as much as possible, and the next one can be actually that the first strategy needs to comprehend with the compensation for emissions by equivalent carbon saving elsewhere. But the carbon offsetting itself can be achieved in two ways, basically, by two approaches, let's say. Firstly are the compensatory offsets, which means buying emissions reductions from elsewhere. It means that you pay towards projects to reduce carbon emissions elsewhere, and also for example, the investment in environmental projects, renewable energy, waste management, and that sort of projects. And the second approach is the carbon removals, which are using some kind of technologies, for example, like the carbon capture and carbon storage technologies, or using the tree planting and reforestation. But carbon offsetting alone is not enough and doesn't make you carbon neutral, let's say. This should be accompanied, as we said, by implementation of suitable measures to proactively reduce your carbon footprint. This means avoiding emitting GHGs in the first place. The approach, we call it decarbonization. So, as a business, why we should care about CO2 emissions here? Apart from the first and foremost, obviously, is the climate emergency and our social responsibility to tackle it. But apart from the the environmental and our social responsibility, there are some other benefits to reducing carbon emissions for SMEs as well. The first one would be the reducing operation costs. Cutting carbon emissions goes hand in hand with boosting energy efficiency, which means lower utility bills and other expenses. So although taking actions imposes some upfront costs for you, but at the end of the day, when you have implemented them, you will definitely save some money in the long run. Also, it boosts your competitiveness in the market for your products and for your services that you provide, because as we know, customers are increasingly becoming conscious and caring about the environmental issues. So carbon reduction boosts your brand value and boosts your reputation in the market. It also helps you to keep up with the regulatory compliance. We have, for example, the CRP requirement for the procurements for the government these days, which is a regulation recently set up for businesses who want to trade with government in major contracts, and also it's using that you can getting ahead of regulations and market shift positions businesses to thrive in the long term as this transition continues. And lastly, but not least, it will enable some funding opportunities for your business and grants which are allocated to businesses who want to be green, and there are lots of local council grants. They are governmental grants that you can apply and use them for your company. But where to start our net zero journey? This graph shows the general journey approach taken to this kind of common route that all businesses have to take to reach net zero. It starts with finding what is the carbon footprint in your base year. Then we set the commitment and targets for when and how much we have to decarbonize our activities, and then we once we have these targets set, then we need to set planned actions and timeframes to achieve them. In the third step, this is the step that we produce carbon reduction plan, the CRP, which we had a touch on that, and which is increasingly actually becoming central in the space, and is now the requirement for, as we said, major contracts with the government, and this is also one of the services that we provide. But today we are mostly focused on the fourth and fifth stage. Based on this plan, then the next step will be implementing the energy efficiency and renewable measures and emission reduction interventions. Basically, we also develop and implement some strategies to engage employees in the net zero journey and make the progress. At the end, the next step deal with the supply chain management, carbon offsetting, and monitoring processes, which are further steps for reaching net zero and controlling it. So we can simply to the first three steps as plans, and the actions, and the last steps as maintaining or maintenance the plan. But today we're gonna focus mainly in the first two, in the actually the two middle steps, which are related to action plans. But before diving into the solutions, we have to understand the current state of the energy consumption and carbon footprint within the company. That's how we can identify the gaps and opportunities in terms of energy performance, carbon reduction across all the operations in our business. So we have to make a thorough evaluation of past and present energy consumption and patterns. This information helps us to detect energy and carbon intensive areas where improvements can be made. This also makes the groundwork for identifying the priorities in energy efficiency upgrades. And finally, this enables us to monitor the effectiveness of energy saving initiatives that we have implemented and make adjustments if needed. The energy data that we need to collect as the first step can be obtained by measuring the energy consumption from utility meters, from electricity and natural gas, mainly located in the property. These data are often available in the utility bills, but more regular monitoring is also highly recommended to keep a record of the energy usage in shorter intervals, for example, every week or even every day. But if you have a smart meter already installed in your premises, you probably will be able to get the half-hourly data from the smart meters. This data can be provided to the customer in a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, by which you can analyze the patterns of use, intensity, times when the energy might have been wasted. And using if you get that data, Excel data from your supplier, or if you download it from your portal, then you can easily extract it to a figure like that, using Excel, by which you can easily identify the patterns where you have wasted energy, where you have the most intense the time of energy consumption, and etc. But the next stage would be energy audits. By conducting energy audits, companies can identify areas of energy wastage and inefficiency. We basically have three levels of energy audit. The first level, which is the walkthrough analysis, is the most basic level of audits, includes reviewing the energy bills and walking through the sites. This gives us a starting point for making changes or further in-depth auditing. The next level would be the more detailed analysis of the energy consumption, and at this level, we actually broke the energy consumption down by end users, and we also have to interview with the important building personnel who are in charge of the different equipment, or more aware of their consumption pattern, to get some information about the operation and the areas of potential problems within the premises. And the last level of energy audit will be in-depth engineering and cost analysis of the potential changes, and some sub-metering with specific equipment might be needed at this stage. But we don't expect everyone to do in-depth energy audit in their businesses, but at least the level one, the walkthrough energy audit, is absolutely necessary, which can be done also by yourself. We need to identify energy intensive areas specific to your company, and this is vary case by case between businesses, depending on the building, processes, equipment, and the basically working culture of that company. But just that level, the first level of energy audit, gives you enough information to identify areas that require immediate attention and come up with some purpose-built and customized measures to reduce the energy consumption and also boost your environmental performance. Or you can, for level 2 or level 3, you can hire a professional energy auditor to conduct more comprehensive one. But most of the quick win measures that we're going to cover today will be can be done based on the level 1 energy audit. But let's give some top tips to help energy audits if you want to do it yourself. Basically, we need a record of all the energy consumption within the company, how, where, and when the energy is being used, and what is the regular routine of the energy consumption of the company. Therefore, we need, first of all, as many photos and notes as possible. You need to take photograph of building features, for example, the windows, insulation, HVAC systems. We need to take photos from lighting fixtures, appliances, and the plug loads. Also, we need photographs from equipment nameplates where we can find their make, model, serial number, power rating, and information like that. Also, we have to make notes of their the runtime hours, the temperatures, the environmental conditions, the notes that might be helpful in the future for planning and designing the energy efficiency measures. We also need to speak to regular users of the equipment and appliances at the premises, ask them how and how long they use appliances or equipment, if they perform well, or if it seems that they have some problems. Also ask your employees if the lighting and the heating is sufficient in their working environment. Also have some, getting your production managers and line managers to explain the if you have any machines operating in the processes, and the procedure of them, the schedule of operating them, and the possible faults in the system. We also need to keep the record of all these information, store all the documents and catalogs related to equipment, appliances, HVAC, refrigeration, and boiler, pumps, and basically all sorts of the equipment that you use in the building. If you can create a spreadsheet for equipment inventory and the nameplate data, will be really helpful, and also updating this documentation after any changes being made in the company. The other tip is that don't assume that it's the best way because it's always being done that way. Always question if equipment runtime can be reduced. Investigate if some smart controls or setting adjustments can save energy, or identify the insufficient equipment inefficient equipment or inefficient areas within the company. And finally, always is helpful to have a fresh pair of eyes, which can detect some lags that you have that have been hidden from your eyes. So we go to next slide, which is my last slide here. Just to sum up this section, I want to highlight the general approach we usually take in our processes. So it needs to be highlighted that decarbonization starts with reducing consumption and minimizing the waste before moving on to any more further sophisticated interventions, such as installation of renewables, for instance. This is logically, financially, and environmentally best first step in the net zero journey. Consumption reduction makes early carbon and very easy cost reductions for SMEs, while preparing them for more advanced sustainability measures. And also the other kind of general approach we always take is that when it comes to building heating and the AC, fabric first approach is always the approach we highly recommend. Fabric first simply means that the maximizing the performance of the building's envelope to improve the building's energy efficiency. This approach costs you less at the upfront stage and also prepares your building for the future intervention. So we all know that the new generation of building heating system, for example, they operate in lower temperatures. So to be able to prepare your building for next generation of heating systems, you have to make your building as airtight as possible and insulate as much as possible to make it more efficient, basically. And also always consider which energy using processes and equipment are non-essential, for example, or their running time, if their running time can be reduced. For example, AC air conditioning system might be running 24 hours, which can be easily, reduce energy by setting a timer for that, for example. And the final point is that the big impacts always start with the small change and the small savings. Don't expect to make huge saving after the very few initial steps. The scale of the potential saving, basically cost saving that you can make from energy efficiency measures really depends on the current usage and the current level of energy consumption of your business. Larger industrial facilities obviously will have greater cost reductions, and the small businesses will have smaller energy saving and smaller cost saving. And also there are some always no cost behavior changes or no cost measures that you can easily implement in your business to start this net zero journey with no cost. Yeah, that's it from me, and I'm happy to get any questions from you before handing it over to Phil to start with the quick wins measures for your business.
And feel free to either raise a hand or type the questions in the, I think we've got a Q&A box, is that right, Helen? Yeah. Sorry, in the chat. The chat's the reliable place to type questions and answers if you do have any, either now or throughout the rest of the session. Okay, Mo, it looks like we're good to continue. Shall I take over from here?
Yeah, I can stop sharing my screen. And the floor is yours now.
Great, thanks very much, Mo. Right, I'm Phil Norval. I'm head of group for the energy efficiency, renewables and storage group at Decerna. Just bear with me while I share my screen. There we go. Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me okay. thanks, Mo, for that introduction. That gives us a good sort of basis from which to develop some ideas on what to do about energy efficiency and carbon emissions reduction. So this session now, it's called Quick Wins. The idea is to cover some either low cost / no cost measures that can be implemented by businesses to reduce energy consumption in particular, or quick wins that you can gain by taking the right approach towards some more costly, more sizable measures that you might otherwise be considering. So that there's right ways and wrong ways to go about some of this as well. Yeah, there's quite a lot that can be done to decarbonize. Some of it is very, very expensive, and some of it's very trendy. So sort of big solar PV installations, they're all the rage, really popular for good reason, but also quite expensive. And there's other sizable projects that, while effective, are not necessarily essential to make significant decarbonisation improvements to a business. So one issue with some of these low cost, no cost, quick win type interventions is that they can often be quite hard to quantify the benefits from. So things like just introducing changes in people's behavior, for example, it's difficult to measure the impact of doing that. And sometimes the individual measures that you introduce to a business, they may have quite a modest improvement, but collectively they can make a large difference. And so I've mentioned there in the slide that you taking this marginal gains principle, which came out of elite sports, in particular cycling. Even once you think you've made the biggest changes you can and the biggest improvements you can, there's often a large number of small improvements that you can make that individually make a very little difference, but collectively can make a huge difference. And so it's worth considering even some of these fairly minor improvements, because the sum total of them can be quite significant. So the slides that you'll see now that are going to cover quite a lot of ground. First, starting with just a couple of slides about identifying sources of energy waste. It's important to eliminate waste before you make any other sort of significant improvements. It's the lowest cost way to reduce energy consumption. Then nearly every business has a premises, and so we'll focus on some building fabric improvements. Some of them do cost money, some of them are very, very cheap, but there's a strategy to take to do it in the right way, to make sure that that you're not sort of throwing good money after bad, as it were. Similarly with lighting, specifically LED lighting, it can be expensive, but there are ways to do it that are a bit smarter than just simply replacing one light with another. And then from after lighting, we'll jump into building services, by which I mean heating, cooling, ventilation, that sort of thing. And then after that, I'll talk a bit about compressed air. I'm not sure the kind of industries that you're all from, but in manufacturing and engineering in particular, compressed air is pretty ubiquitous, and it's one of the biggest areas for improvement in a lot of places. So talk about that a little bit as well. And then beyond that, I'll go on to talk about a few sort of what not to do's, and some mistakes that we've seen in the past. And after that, I'll jump into a separate session just to introduce some concepts around renewables. So after the quick wins, we'll talk about the slightly more costly renewable energy systems for a little bit. So firstly, identifying energy waste. We do an awful lot of site surveys, and as Mo mentioned, quite often the fresh pair of eyes is as much a benefit as any expertise that we might be bringing to the site. It's often the case that people are so heavily focused on doing their own work, working to their strengths and just carrying out their day-to-day duties, that they're not necessarily sort of concerning themselves too much with energy efficiency, which is quite understandable. Energy efficiency is not always the most convenient thing to consider when doing your work. For example, if it was in a factory, somebody might leave one of their tools switched on or one of their machines switched on just because it's convenient to have it on and ready for when they next need it. But it may be using energy the entire time it's on, even if it's just sitting on standby or idling. And that's a potential source for energy waste. And it's things like that that businesses, they often overlook or just don't have the time or resource to sort of consider day to day, and often they'll become blind to a lot of these things because thinking of it in any other way is kind of a hindrance to just going about the normal day-to-day work. So to make some easy improvements to energy efficiency, it requires somebody either from outside the company or from inside the company just to take a different perspective, take a step back, and think about these things from another angle, paying particular attention to energy efficiency. But there is often a bit of detective work that's needed, and that detective work is so that you can find where energy is being wasted, if energy is being wasted, and finding the exact cause of it. And that work can take the form of doing energy monitoring, either looking at energy bills, the half-hourly energy billing that Mo showed earlier, or putting in equipment where you can record energy consumption either at the level of a distribution board or at the level of an individual piece of equipment. And you can measure energy use indirectly as well, using things like environmental monitors and meters that record things like light levels or the temperature in a room, to indicate when lights are switched on or when heating is running, or if in the case of a factory, if there's a lot of motors that are running, you can just record the sound or the vibration of that equipment, and that would indicate when it's been switched on and when it's been switched off, and from that you can then work out how much energy it's consuming and how much of the time it is operating, and if that sort of time use profile matches the work schedule, or if equipment might be getting left switched on outside of working hours, for example. Excuse me, sorry. Yes, so we'll jump into the building fabric improvements, so namely insulation and draft proofing. There's as with many things, there's a sort of a logical hierarchy to approach this with, and specifically talking about building fabric, there are a number of different improvements that you might consider making, draft proofing being one of them, and the various kinds of insulation improvements being the others. There's a general there's a general sort of order in which these things should really be considered. The logic being that you should implement the lowest cost improvements with the highest impact first, and work from there down to the sort of highest cost, lowest impact measures. And the general case is that draft proofing is by far the lowest cost improvement that you can make, and also has one of the highest impacts in a lot of buildings, particularly old ones where there's a lot of draftiness and air leakage through things like the side around the sides of window frames, under doors, cracks in walls, even, or between the walls and floors of buildings. But moving on from that, you can see on the slide here that the order in which to assess things in terms of lowest cost to highest cost and highest impact down to lowest impact, it kind of goes in this order. So roof space loft insulation is quite a cheap kind of insulation to install, and cavity wall insulation quite similar, all the way down to double glazing, which is a really expensive option. So just bear with me a sec. Yeah, so as I mentioned, draft proofing is the thing to do first, especially if you're looking for low cost options, or even no cost options in some cases. It's one of these things that is usually such a low cost with such a large impact on energy efficiency that it's probably worth doing without worrying about specifically how much energy it's going to save or how much it's going to cost to install, because it's one of these technologies that can generally be installed by people on site, by unskilled staff, with no specialist training needed. A lot of the products that are used to draft proof a building are designed for consumers to install. And the drafts in buildings, poor air tightness, in other words, it's often sort of the biggest component to heat loss in a building, particularly in commercial buildings. And therefore, it's probably worth just making sure that drafts are eliminated wherever possible, without needing to run any sort of particular feasibility study or business case assessment or anything like that. And also, because air leaks can be such a significant part of heat loss in a building, it really does need to be addressed before any other energy efficiency sort of insulation improvements are considered, because heat will kind of take the path of least resistance, and you can insulate up to the highest standard, but if there are gaps around the walls and windows, you're still going to be losing a lot of heat. For example, if you have a warehouse with a roller shutter door, there's very little point in adding huge amounts of insulation to the walls or the roof if that roller shutter door is wide open, because all of the heat's just going to be blasting through that door, and the insulation is going to add very little to the building's performance. So when it comes to draft proofing, there's actually it's more than the simple effect of reducing heat leaking out of a building. There is actually a compound effect that makes it doubly effective to the sort of comfort level experienced by people in a building. Not only does sealing up drafts prevent heat escaping from a building, it also it reduces the amount of air movement in a building. So you've all heard the term wind chill. That's a sort of extreme version of this, but basically the more air movement there is, the more of a cooling effect there is on people's skin. And so you'll be familiar with sitting in it, with the feeling of sitting in a draft, and that's not necessarily cold air blowing on you. It's just the fact that there is air moving at all. Air at a given temperature feels cooler if it's moving than if it's stationary. So drafts in a building will increase the amount of air movement, and therefore for people to feel comfortable, the temperature needs to be that little bit higher where the air is moving around more. So sealing up drafts will have that double effect of preventing heat loss, but also making people just feel more comfortable at any given temperature. It's worth, so when it comes to draft proofing, it's worth doing a kind of a site survey, really, to assess where air is leaking. It's quite easy to identify drafts. You can feel the cool breeze wherever there is a draft, as I'm sure you're aware. But even it's worth carrying out one of these surveys, even if you think that there have been air tightness improvements installed sometime in the building's history. Over time, the things like the sort of foam rubber seals around windows and doors, they can deteriorate or they can be painted over. It's quite common to see these draft seals being gloss painted, and then they become far less effective and they can become compressed and then begin to allow drafts to re-emerge through those openings. So it's worth just going around and seeing if those seals are actually doing their job, and it might be worth replacing them or adding more sealant into those areas. There are cases though where simple improvements like adding some foam or brush strips or tape, it just isn't up to the job. Buildings do move over time. Things like windows and door frames and other sort of joins in a building, they can open up, and it can become such a problem that you do then need some professional help. That the example in the picture there is a single glazed aluminium window frame, which to start with is pretty bad in terms of insulation. But in this case, the building had moved so much over time. There was a good inch air gap. Effectively, you've got an open window there, and in this case, the room was freezing, but the heating was absolutely blasting out of the radiators, and so the amount of energy waste just from that single room was absolutely huge, and probably equivalent to most of the rest of the building combined. And the fact that it was a high-rise building meant that the wind outside was really quite severe a lot of the time. So the heat loss from that particular building was really quite extreme. But yes, something to be aware of, and that's when it does verge on being more of a professional, skilled piece of work to fix. So as I showed in a few slides ago, there's this hierarchy of building fabric or insulation improvements. And so talking about insulation itself, we can, once you've sorted the air tightness of a building out, it's then worth thinking about the strategy for improving insulation and sticking to that kind of hierarchy. If it's possible to insulate your roof space, to carry out loft insulation, that's usually the cheapest and one of the most effective things to start off with. It doesn't require a great deal of skill to install. It doesn't require a huge amount of disruption, and there's very little in the way of cosmetic remedial work required afterwards, because usually the loft insulation is out of sight and there's no actual fixing down required. So the cost is pretty low. Similarly with cavity wall insulation, usually that's a similar price per square meter of insulation, but it's usually not as thick, so the insulation, the energy savings from it aren't quite as good as loft insulation. But you can see in this table the general cost per square meter and the payback period goes in that kind of order down to, so after cavity wall insulation, there are options for solid walls where there's no wall cavity. You could insulate either internally in the rooms themselves or on the outside of the building. The reason they're so expensive is that they do require remedial work afterwards to leave an aesthetically satisfactory finish, either by adding plasterboard on the inside or a weatherproof render or cladding on the outside of the building. And you also need to consider shifting all of the things like on the inside, things like skirting boards, plug sockets, potentially plumbing outlets, furniture, any fixed furniture would need moving as well. And so there's a lot to consider there. And on the outside, similarly, there's things like window frames, other elements fixed to the outside of walls like drainage and ventilation equipment. So that's why they get so expensive, although the actual energy savings can be quite significant. So right down at the bottom here, double glazing. It's a really popular thing to install and for people to want to install. And I did indicate it's down at the bottom there, but I just wondered if anyone might have an idea of how long it takes for double glazing to pay for itself. In other words, if you have a business that installs double glazing to replace its old single glaze windows, how long do you think it might take for the energy savings from that improvement to pay for the initial cost of the double glazing? My colleague Helen is going to unleash a quick poll on you, just so you can have a guess. Yeah, sorry about that slight technical issue. The wrong poll was issued, but yes, here you can see the double glazing poll now. So if you have a go at answering that, we'll come back to the compressed air one later on. Okay. Yeah, so it looks like most of you have had a go at answering that. And yeah, so 30 years payback period is actually quite optimistic. I think for it to be any better than that, you'd have to have extremely high energy costs for heating. The reality is that the energy savings themselves rarely show a payback period within the lifespan of the double glazing. And so sometimes there are additional benefits. So that simply the insulation benefit of double glazing is not going to cover the cost of the system itself, but the improvement in things like air tightness by installing new window frames, that can significantly improve the benefits of installing double glazing. But very often it becomes something that's done out of necessity, either because the window frames have deteriorated so much that they need replacement, or aesthetically the building just needs updating. So in terms of simple insulation improvements, it's only ever going to be a very modest energy saving unless you have a huge amount of glazing compared to the wall area of your building. Right, I'm just going to find my slides again. Here we go. Right, thanks for that. So that was building fabric. I'm going to jump into LED lighting briefly, which is something that is pretty well understood now, and it's pretty well accepted that LED lighting in most situations is going to save energy compared to the older lighting types. And in fact, now it's really the only option that you have in almost all situations for new lighting. There was a phase out that happened last year, towards the start of the autumn last year, which made it illegal for manufacturers to produce any new fluorescent lighting tubes. So even the more energy efficient thin type, what they call T5 fluorescent tubes, those, but even also the older types of fluorescent lights, industrial lighting like metal halide, or I think high pressure sodium as well, because not because of energy efficiency, but because all of those they have some amount of mercury in them. It's the environmental impact of disposing of them meant that they were no longer acceptable. And once retailers have sold out of all of their old stock, you won't be able to buy them anymore. So LEDs in nearly every case are the only option left. But so although by default people will be installing new LED lighting, and they generally will save at least 50% of the energy consumption of lights if you're replacing older fluorescent lighting or similar. There are some important considerations to bear in mind before you just simply replace one old light with a new LED. It can be pretty costly as well. So especially if there's specialist lighting, like in a sports venue, the actual cost to install, or maybe to access certain lighting types, it can be really quite significant. And so doing something with the sort of traditional lighting upgrade approach has often been, when a light fails, you replace it with an LED. But so going piecemeal around a building, replacing each failure with a new one, that's not necessarily the best approach, especially if things like access equipment are required. It can be far more cost effective to be a bit more strategic about it and to plan ahead, and to consider a whole site LED upgrade, partly because it's usually cheaper to purchase a large number of lights rather than one at a time. Also, if you do need something like scaffolding or powered access equipment, you might only need to hire that once rather than hire it repeatedly. And also there are benefits from taking a whole site top-down approach to an LED lighting project, which you wouldn't be able to achieve if you were doing it one light at a time. One of those things to consider is the lighting in a building is not necessarily appropriate for how the site is being used. And so, for example, it's quite common to find an office where the light levels are just too high, or if you were to replace each existing light with a new LED, the greater directionality of the LED lights, in other words, the light that they put out is usually pointed more in the direction it's needed compared to older lighting types, and therefore if you replace one LED with the equivalent lighting output fluorescent light, you'll end up with a brighter space than you might expect. And so it's not necessarily sensible to just simply replace every single light fitting with a new LED. You could end up using far more energy from the lighting than you actually need to. And so that's something that you may not be able to fix by simply replacing one light with another as they fail. So if you take the whole site approach, you can do a proper new lighting design and make sure that you're only installing the lights that you actually need. And there's a misconception that I've come across a few times when I've done site energy audits, and that is that where you do have fluorescent lights, rather than replacing the light fitting with an LED to save energy, I've seen it a few times where people have taken out one of the tubes within that fitting. For example, if there's 4 tubes per fitting in a ceiling grid type light fitting, you could take out one of those tubes to reduce the light output and, in theory, save energy, perhaps a quarter of the energy. But if the lighting is of a sufficiently old variety, the ballast, the equipment, the device in the fitting that provides the voltage that the fluorescent tubes require to operate, it can actually continue consuming energy with or without a tube in it, and so it can actually be worse for the light fitting in terms of lifespan and consume pretty much the same amount of energy even if one of the tubes is taken out. If you do plan to do a sort of a whole site lighting upgrade, like I say, being a bit planning appropriately for it and being strategic about it is the way to go. And it's quite simple to work out the kind of energy consumption to expect from something like LED lighting. And it can be quite an accurate prediction from a simple calculation. So very briefly, just it may be obvious to some of you, but if you wanted to work out the kind of energy savings that you might be able to achieve from a lighting upgrade, all you need to do is identify the lights that you currently have. You can, if you're able to look closely at one of your fluorescent tubes, for example, it should tell you the wattage right on the tube. Count up the number of tubes or lamps of that particular type, and then work out the total wattage. So the number of lamps times the individual lamp wattage. Divide it by 1,000 to get it into kilowatts, and do the same thing for the proposed new lights. Take the new light the kilowatt total of the new lights from the kilowatt total of the old lights, and then multiply it by the number of hours of use you expect them to see over a year. And that will tell you the annual kilowatt hour saving of that lighting upgrade. So it really is pretty simple to come up with a decent estimate of energy savings, and you can play around with the design, the lighting, the specific lighting products that you plan to use, and just see what the effect is and see where the sort of sweet spot is in terms of energy savings versus capital cost. One thing to be aware of, though, is, and you may have experienced this by buying cheap LEDs from certain well-known international importing type online shops, you may have noticed that if you buy LED lights that are particularly cheap and not of a known brand, that they fail really quickly. And it's really common because LED lighting, it comes in a vast spectrum of quality, and if you don't go with a sort of a known brand that has some kind of representation in this country, you're not likely to get the kind of warranty or quality that you should expect from electrical equipment. And as a guide, when we're recommending a lighting upgrade, we try to find appropriate light fittings and lamps that have around a 5-year warranty and about a 50,000 hour life expectancy, if at all possible. And that should indicate that it's of a decent quality, but also try and go for brands that you recognize or that have a strong presence within this country, so that you have some kind of recourse if there is a quality issue. A few years ago, there was a project carried out by the EU called Premium Light Pro, and that was to try and address the difficulty of identifying high quality lighting systems. And although it's a few years old now, there is still there's still some good guidance within that project and the reports that they generated. And so if you're considering designing a new lighting system yourself, or if you want to be armed with some good information before you get a contractor to propose a new system for you, then take a look at that guide there, and it should give you all the information you might need to make sure that you're getting something of high enough quality. So talked about replacing lights and installing new LEDs, but it's just doing that is not necessarily the only way to save energy from lighting, and there can be some much lower cost, simple improvements either with the new lighting that you might be installing or even with the existing lights that you have. And and it's all to do with the control of the lights. So there's various control types for lighting, some of which you'll be pretty familiar with, and very often they're all designed to save energy. One of the most common things that you're probably most directly familiar with are the motion sensors that you might see from you'll probably see them in places like toilets and bathrooms, sometimes in corridors and other spaces that are only used intermittently. The lights switch on automatically when somebody comes into the room, and they'll switch off after a given time. Or if they so sometimes they're based on motion, sometimes they're based on infrared sensors, so they'll detect heat from people or other objects in the room, and only switch off when that heat detection when that detected heat goes away. Some people absolutely hate these kind of things because I've experienced it a lot, but I'm sure everyone else has. When you go into somewhere like a toilet, if you stand or sit still for just sometimes sort of 30 seconds, you can all of a sudden be left in complete darkness, and it's pretty disconcerting when that happens. But that's not the be all and end all of those kind of systems. That's often a case that they just haven't been set up correctly. The time that they are left switched on for can be adjusted in nearly every case, and so just a tweak of the actual settings in those controls should mean that they work far more appropriately. And with correct setup, sensors like that can be used in a lot more locations than people realize. So corridors is one example, but also even office spaces, using the right kind of controls and with the right sort of time settings can ensure that as long as people are in there doing some kind of activity, the lights will stay on. And it's worth considering putting these in anywhere where it's at all possible, because studies have shown that the energy saving from using these kind of sensors can be anywhere between 30 to 80%. So even at the most pessimistic estimate, you're still saving about a third of the energy from your lighting by installing these sensors. So it's worth installing them wherever you think it might be acceptable. We've seen some good results from having them installed in warehousing, for example. So spaces where there's tall aisles of shelving, so warehouse pallet racking, that sort of thing. If you have a motion sensor at the sort of front end of each of those aisles, then the lighting above those sections can be switched on individually only when they're actually needed. And if they're installed in the right place, then there's no safety risks from having lights off in those areas. They'll switch on whenever there's a person or a forklift truck in the area. So other types of controls that are automated can be based on the time of day or night, or on the light level. And it's important to remember that daylight is a really nice, convenient source of free lighting that's not often maximized in buildings. But places where there's sufficient glazing, either from windows or from roof lights, it's often possible to balance that daylight level with artificial lighting through the use of either off-on sensors or slightly fancier dimming controls, so that only when the amount of daylight available drops below a certain level do the artificial lights inside switch on. And I've seen it in warehouses and factories where there's a lot of roof lighting, a lot of transparent roof panels, that throughout a lot of the day artificial lighting is not needed, although it's usually switched on anyway. But with appropriate controls, the actual light level can be maintained by brightening or dimming the indoor lighting appropriately, so that the overall light in the space is kept the same. And that's something that's not often done, although those kind of day and night sensors, as you can see in the picture there, they're quite common for outdoor lighting. So things like security lighting, car park lighting, that kind of thing. It's they're pretty common in those situations, but not so common for managing the daylight levels within a building. Going even further, if you have a building management system, BMS, or some kind of smart control system for lighting, the time of use of that lighting can be controlled automatically based on things like room booking systems. So in a place like a hotel or anywhere where there's a hospitality suite, the room booking system can be tied to the lighting, so that the lights only come on when those rooms are in use. And all of this just ensures that the use of lighting does not depend on somebody switching the lights off when they leave a room. And it saves somebody, especially on a large site, it saves somebody having to walk around the entire site to just switching off lights, which is often a chore that people don't want to have to do all the time. And so automating this process is usually guaranteed to save a lot of energy, and the paybacks from installing these kind of controls is that it's usually measured in months rather than years. And so again, it's one of these quick wins that's probably worth doing, whether or not you are going to calculate the potential benefits of it. It's worth being aware. I mentioned security lighting and outdoor lighting, but the traditional way to control these things is often with one of these mechanical time clocks. If you ever look in a plant room or a meter cupboard, it's quite common to see one of these, as shown in the photo there. They do a job. They switch lights off at a certain time of day and switch them on at a certain time of day, but they're very limited, and they're often completely ignored. So they're when they're installed, they're set up in a certain way and then never touched ever again. But they're not always set appropriately for the current use of the building. They only have a single on-off setting. So the major problem with them is that they will operate in exactly the same way 7 days a week. And so if you have a car park that has lighting controlled with one of these, for example, you may not need that lighting on over the weekend when there's nobody there. Again, you probably don't need the same settings in the summer as you do in the winter. And so these kind of controls are not particularly smart. And in the case of a site that's closed during the weekend, you might be using 2/7 of the more energy than you actually need to. There's two days out of 7 that you don't need that lighting on, but this control type isn't sophisticated enough to deal with that. So it's quite straightforward to install a more modern digital 7-day programmer in place of one of these mechanical clocks, and you can save a significant chunk of energy, because particularly outdoor lighting, it's usually very high powered. Sort of, we're talking a couple of 100 watts per fitting, and so definitely worth considering. So jumping now into I'm just going to check the time actually. Oh, we're okay. So we'll talk now a bit about heating, ventilation, air conditioning, or HVAC for short. It's some elements of this people will be pretty familiar with, specifically the heating side of it, but the ventilation and the air conditioning is something that is usually left to experts to understand. But it's there are things to consider that don't need a great level of expertise to make improvements to. And so in general, there's some things to consider with these sort of systems. I recommend that somebody in your company takes a look at least once every 6 months at things like the time settings for heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and the sort of temperature set points that they've been programmed to. The reason I say at least once every 6 months is, especially where there's heating and cooling in a building, you have a heating season which usually starts around October and ends around March or maybe April. And conversely, you might have a cooling season which covers the other half of the year. And so these heating and cooling seasons run for half the year. And if you don't check the settings at the start of that season, you could incur significant energy waste throughout that season. And so there's an opportunity to revise the set points and programs before the heating or cooling season each year, so that you don't end up hitting yourselves in the wallet but by having inappropriate settings. When you do review these sort of settings, it's there's some things to check. Specifically, have a look to see if the previous settings have been changed at all. It's really common, especially if you have something like a thermostat in an office, really common for these things to be changed a few times a day even. And the original intention of the system could have been completely overruled or overridden by individual preferences. But it may be the case that the time programs that were set are no longer appropriate. If shift patterns have changed, or the rooms that are used regularly have changed, perhaps entire offices have been sort of mothballed because people are working from home more, for example. The program, the controls, and the sort of time settings and things, they should be obviously adjusted to reflect that new usage. But it's something that's often just completely forgotten about. Even where a space is in use, it's worth just canvassing the opinion of the occupants of that space to see if in general people are comfortable. Usually it's got to be done sort of democratically, because everyone feels a different level of comfort for any given temperature in a space. But canvass opinion just to see if people are comfortable in terms of the temperature in a room. And it might be that people find that it's far too hot, or it swings from one extreme to another, or too cold when the air conditioning's on. And so there could well be some potential energy savings there by just being more conservative with the settings of those systems. To go a step further, there might be some energy savings possible based on some data gathering that is carried out. So you can do some simple logging of the actual temperatures, humidity levels, CO2 levels in a space over a reasonably long period, just to verify that the controls of these systems are delivering what they've been told to do. So it's possible that you might set a room to 20 degrees, but it's actually there's actually a sort of a discrepancy between the set point and the real temperature. So verify that a room is getting to the temperature it's set to, and how long it takes to reach those kind of temperatures. So in other words, to see if they're getting to the temperature you want them to at the time you want them to. It's excuse me. The time it takes for a building to get to the temperature it's set to can then be used to determine the time that the heating or cooling, for that matter, needs to be switched on at. So you can if a room takes an hour to get up to temperature, then you probably need to set the heating to come on an hour before the space is in use. But similarly, when people all go home at the end of the day, it's not, you could be missing a trick by switching the heating off at that time. If a building or an individual office or room, if it cools down quite slowly, then it's very reasonable to switch the heating system off in advance of the end of a certain work shift. So you might be able to switch the heating system off, say, an hour before everyone goes home, because by the time they do go home, the building's just cooled down to the sort of the minimum level that's acceptable. And an hour of heating it can be quite a significant saving each day. It easily kind of 10% of the energy consumption from heating. So yeah, certainly worth considering doing that. And that's usually best done after taking a recording of the temperature over time, so that you know exactly what you can get away with doing. If you do have heating and cooling, heating and ventilation, or cooling and ventilation in a building, these combined systems could be there is the potential that they work against each other. So an obvious example is if you have a boiler-fed radiator system in a room as well as air conditioning. If they're both switched on, so you've got heating and the air conditioning on at the same time, they are likely to work against each other if they're not set up properly. And so the heating is heating up the space, and the cooling system thinks, hang on, this is getting too warm. Better start cooling the place. You'll end up they'll end up cancelling each other out and just throwing energy away. And it sounds like an absolutely stupid thing to do, but it happens all the time. It's even happened in our office once or twice, just because these systems don't always talk to each other. And if they are being sort of fiddled with multiple times a day by the occupants in individual spaces, it's just a matter of time before these interventions kind of conspire against each other. So you don't necessarily have to lock people out of fiddling with these things, but just somebody needs to just check that the systems are kind of working together rather than against each other. To get a bit more into the kind of data analysis side of things, with heating in particular, it's worth measuring consumption, even just by looking at energy bills. So usually it's going to be gas bills for a building. Check the monthly consumption against what's called energy benchmarks. So buildings of any given type can usually be matched up to a specific energy benchmark, which is measured in terms of kilowatt hours per meter square per year of fossil fuels or electricity. So offices, schools, hospitals, factories, theatres, they all have these statistical average energy consumption figures, which you can then measure yourselves against. And if you are consuming more energy per meter square per year than the benchmark, it might indicate that you're not as efficient as you could be. If you want to go even further, you can check if heating and cooling are being controlled appropriately, by looking at something called heating degree days. We don't really have enough time to go into that in detail, but basically it's a measure of how often and by how much the the weather falls below the temperature at which your building would need to be heated. And if you, with some data analysis, you can see how well your heating consumption responds to changes in temperature over a year. And if it's well controlled, there'll be a really strong correlation between energy consumption and outdoor weather. And if it's poorly controlled, then the correlation is less good, or there may be no correlation if there's really poor control. And that kind of assessment can indicate if there's some improvements that can be made to the controls of your heating, or in some cases cooling systems. And very simply, finally, on this slide, it's almost a cliche, but just consider reducing the heating set point by just 1 or 2 degrees. And that tiny little change, which is almost imperceivable to most people, can have a really noticeable impact on energy consumption. So a 1 or 2 degree drop, it really can save 10% of your energy consumption. So if you can get away with it, then absolutely do that. Yeah, so that's some general points for heating systems, but getting into some more specifics, talking about simple improvements in terms of lagging of pipework. Again, this is something that can be done by non-specialists very often, unless it's a sort of a really sophisticated commercial plant room. But it's really common when you go into a boiler room to find there's lots of pipework that's not insulated properly, and it's one of the worst places to have uninsulated pipework, because boiler rooms in particular are usually very, very highly ventilated, where there's a commercial boiler, because they need air to mix with the fuel to burn properly, but also the ventilation is to get rid of anything like carbon monoxide that might have collected if the boiler's not operating properly. So it's a safety issue as well. But the effect of having that much ventilation in a boiler plant room is that the space is effectively outdoors. The indoor air is mixing so quickly with the outdoor air that you're basically exposing any unlagged pipework to the outdoor air. And if you imagine the sort of temperature of the outdoor air versus the temperature of the pipes, there's the heat lost to that air can be huge. And so, as an example, the graph here that you can see, it shows for a given size of pipework along the horizontal axis, it shows the amount of heat that's lost per meter of that pipework, and the different lines are for different temperatures, different temperature differences between the pipe and the surrounding air. And it's typical for a plant room, as I say, as effectively exposed to outdoor air. You might have 70-degree pipe temperatures and 15-degree air temperatures. That represents a 55-degree temperature difference between the pipe and the air, and so that is represented by the top grey line in this graph. And so if you have kind of a commercial pipework system around 50, 75 millimeter pipes, you're going to be losing around 150 watts per meter of uninsulated pipe. And so it's quite conceivable that you'll have 10 or 15 meters of this pipe in a plant room. And if it's unlagged, that it's basically equivalent to a decent sized radiator just kicking out heat effectively outdoors. And so you can imagine the amount of energy waste through that situation is really quite significant. Imagine instead of that, you literally install a radiator on an outside wall how much energy you might be wasting, and it's basically the same thing. And adding some lagging to pipe work, it's not always something that you need to get a contractor in to do. If there's somebody responsible for facilities on site, it's kind of thing that can be done very, very cheaply, or even without any sort of skilled labour. So even pipes that are in the indoor space, the heated spaces, if they're unlagged, it represents heat loss that's completely uncontrolled. So if a boiler is running, but a particular room doesn't have its radiator switched on, the pipes feeding it will still be hot, and so they're giving heat into a room that doesn't require it. And so entire sections of buildings can have their heating switched off, but the pipe's still hot. And so without lagging those pipes, it represents a huge source of energy waste, or at least lack of control of the heating system. Any pipe work that is out of sight, particularly above ceiling tiles or in roof spaces, is often left uninsulated, and those spaces are not classed as part of the heated space. And so without lagging those pipes, it can be a huge source of energy waste. Above ceiling tiles, it's really common that there's openings in the walls at the sides of those spaces to let pipe work in or to ventilate them for some reason. And so again, the outdoor air is circulating really well around those pipes, and the heat loss therefore can be really, really high. And because it's out of sight, it's often out of mind. So if anyone's doing a site energy survey, it's worth just where it's safe to do so, just poking your head above ceiling tiles or into a loft space just to see if there's any exposed pipe work like that. I mentioned radiators being switched off. The thing, it's very, very much the case that most radiators have a thermostatic radiator valve. If there isn't one on a radiator, then absolutely install a thermostatic radiator valve so that you can automatically control the amount of heat they put into a room. But just because there is one installed doesn't mean that they're doing their job properly. Over time, it's really, really common that those valves stick. The little actuator pin that controls whether or not the radiator is being heated, they can stick open or they can stick closed. But if they stick open, then adjusting the temperature setting of those valves isn't going to do anything. It's really common in a room that's been sort of neglected for some time to have the radiators sort of nominally switched to the off position, but they're still blasting out heat. And that's a case of that valve being stuck in the open position. And it might be that that valve just needs somebody to come along and physically activate the valve to unstick it, or the valve head might need replacing. But either way, it's either zero cost or very low cost to improve it, and it can save, particularly in a room that isn't in use, it can save a huge amount of energy, because it can be the difference between a radiator operating at full blast or being switched off. And so it's another thing to consider during a site energy survey, just to verify that those valves are actually working properly. So we've talked about heating systems, but another related area is domestic hot water. So the hot water that comes out of taps and showers. It's usually a smaller overall energy consumption, but it's quite often the source of a lot of unnecessary consumption as well, particularly in larger commercial buildings where they have what's called a secondary circulation system. If that's not something you're familiar with, basically you will have experienced being in a building where the hot water tap is a long way from the boiler or the cylinder, and it takes an age for the hot water to come out of the tap. To avoid that happening in larger buildings, it's common to have this loop of pipework around which hot water is being continually pumped, so that there's only a short distance from that loop to the actual tap or shower outlet, so that for the convenience of people in the building, the hot water is readily available without having to wait for it to come through. So it's a really nice, convenient thing to have, but it, as you might imagine, that loop of pipework is nowhere near as well insulated as the cylinder it might be coming out of, if it even is insulated. It's really common to find these secondary circulation systems have no lagging on the pipework, either in the plant room or around the rest of the building. I've seen literally hundreds of meters of unlagged secondary circulation pipework that is just absolutely bouncingly hot, and it's often hidden away again above ceiling tiles or in loft spaces. So it's again out of sight, out of mind. Simply lagging it will save a huge amount of energy because it's constantly being kept hot by the pump that circulates that water around. So the first thing to do with this situation is lag the pipework, but also the pump that runs that sends the heat around these pipes. It's quite often running 24/7, so that heat is always available at the taps. But it's entirely unnecessary to have that pump running out of operating hours of the business. So in the simplest thing you can do to improve that is to have some kind of time switch on the pump, so that it's set to only run when people are going to be using the building, and that can save literally thousands of pounds just by not allowing heat to be drawn out of the cylinder when it's not required. But also, you'll save more energy from the pump itself because that uses electricity to operate. You might be able to literally half the energy consumption of that pump by putting in an appropriate timer switch. But even further, you can replace the pump with a modern energy efficient one that can have its speed adjusted according to demand. And so if the temperature of the pipe is not dropping, then that indicates that there's no hot water being drawn from the taps. And so the pump can be a modern variable speed pump can be combined with a sensor that just ensures that the temperature is maintained, and that can therefore vary the speed according to how much heat is actually being drawn from that system. So there's quite a lot can be done there, and none of these things are particularly expensive to do. You may need to get a heating engineer in to do things like replace pumps, or put timer switches in, but and it's worth noting that hot water is not to be taken lightly. There are the risks of scalds from hot water systems and exposed hot water pipework. Anywhere where hot water is stored is a potential source of Legionella risk if there's water being held at sort of tepid temperatures for long periods of time. So it's definitely worth getting things like that assessed by a professional. Usually doing things like lagging hot water pipe work is pretty low risk, but anything to do with the control of a system needs to be done by somebody that understands the risks and knows how to operate and work in those kind of environments. This is a bit of a sort of a counterintuitive thing to consider, but in buildings where there's really long runs of hot water pipe work to the outlet, potentially. So if there's a boiler room at one end of a building and a hot water outlet at the other end of a building, there could be a huge amount of heat lost just in the pipe that takes the heat from one end to the other. And so although something like a gas hot water system is comparatively pretty cheap per kilowatt hour of energy compared to something like an electric hot water heater, the fact that that sort of situation can lose so much heat to the environment through the pipework means that the alternative option of putting a simple electric water heater at the point of use, that it can actually be significantly cheaper to do that than to send heat all the way from the boiler to where it's needed. Also, you in some situations you might be heating up an entire 100 or 200 litre hot water cylinder just to provide hot water for the short amount of time it's needed at the other end of a building. And so so in that kind of situation, you're heating up far more water than is actually needed for the demand. And so something like a small point of use electric water heater can be tailored to the demand a lot better. And so although it's more expensive per kilowatt hour, the number of kilowatt hours used can be much lower by that setup. And so it's a bit counterintuitive, but in some situations it's probably worth considering. Again, to reduce the actual amount of hot water needed, it's worth installing things like self-closing taps, the sort of the push to open type taps, and put low flow tap heads in to reduce the amount of water flowing out of them. They're usually marketed to save water in terms of to reduce the number of litres of water that you're actually using. But if you're reducing the number of litres of hot water, you're also reducing the amount of energy consumed. And so it's worth considering installing things like that in any hot water taps. Again, a very simple measure, costs nothing, but putting some kind of signage in, where there is a hot water tap to advise people not to leave the taps running, to question if they even need to use hot water, just keeps energy efficiency in the mind of occupants, and can have a much bigger effect than you might expect. And it's not simply the case that, for example, reducing the fan speed by half reduces energy consumption by half. There's actually like an exponential relationship between fan speed and energy consumption. So you can see here, increasing a fan speed by 26% actually results in a 100% increase in power consumption or energy consumption. Conversely, reducing the speed of a fan by just 21% will actually halve its energy consumption. So in other words, the fan speed, if you double a fan speed, you'll actually increase energy consumption by 8 times. It's not even a square relationship, it's a cube relationship between those two values. And so just a modest changes in fan speed will have a huge effect on energy consumption. So if it's possible, if you're looking at upgrading a ventilation system, getting some sort of automatic control with variable speed fans will definitely save a lot of energy. Moving on from ventilation, just briefly to air conditioning. It's increasingly common in this country to have air conditioning in buildings, for 2 reasons. Partly climate change, temperatures are getting higher, particularly in the summer in the UK, but also there's been a trend to have more and more electrical equipment in buildings than there were historically, particularly in modern offices. You've got so many computers, printers, other electrical devices, for either productivity or just convenience or luxury. The number of electrical items in most buildings is much higher than it used to be, and all electrical items give off some amount of heat. It's more obvious with things like printers and photocopiers, but collectively the amount of heat given off by electrical equipment has gone up a lot over recent years, and that is often combated with air conditioning. But before anyone installs any new air conditioning or switches the cooling on in a building, it's worth considering is it even necessary? Are there other ways to reduce the temperature of the air in a space other than just switching on cooling systems? Firstly, so another reason why cooling is becoming increasingly common, particularly in modern office buildings, is the amount of glazing that is used in the building's construction. You can imagine if you're sitting in a greenhouse in summer, you're going to get uncomfortably hot, and that's not too far away from what some buildings are like in summer. There's that amount of glazing will cause a huge amount of a huge level of temperature gain when the sun's out, and the sort of the default solution to that problem is to switch some air conditioning on. But much cheaper, much more energy efficient option is to reduce the amount of sunlight getting into the building in the first place. And you can simply manage that by putting something like a solar film on the outside of windows. It's almost unnoticeable, but solar films are designed to reduce the amount of infrared light getting into a space. So you'll still have a decent amount of daylight, but the amount of heating from that sunlight can be reduced by sort of up to 80%. I've seen in some cases. And so if you are in a space where there's a lot of glazing, particularly south facing glazing, and it gets too hot in the summer, rather than using air conditioning, consider something like solar film, which is pretty low cost and really, really effective. And it's much more effective than having blinds on the inside of windows, because something like a roller blind, when it's closed, the sunlight is hitting that blind and heating up. Once the sunlight's gone through the glass, it's too late. Effectively, you're already the energy is already inside the building. So stop the sunlight getting in, getting through the glass with something like a solar film is the right way to go. Other options that alternatives to air conditioning, you can use ventilation at night time when it's colder to cool a building down. This is especially effective if the building's made of heavy construction, so it's got a lot of concrete or brickwork in it, because that extra mass means that it takes quite a long time for a building to heat up or cool down. And so there's quite a lag between putting heating or cooling into a building, either intentionally or unintentionally, from things like sunlight. And the benefit of that is that if you ventilate a building either naturally or mechanically overnight, you've effectively got a cold storage battery in the form of all that thermal mass in a building that will take quite a long time to be used up. And so it'll kind of moderate the temperature throughout the day if it's been allowed to cool down overnight. And that's virtually a free form of cooling, and it is in fact called free night cooling because it doesn't require any actual refrigeration. Another way to minimize the need for air conditioning is to allocate spaces specifically for equipment that kicks out a lot of heat, rather than having that equipment spread around a building. So printers and photocopiers, for example, can have a dedicated room in a much smaller space, so that there's a much lower air volume that needs cooling or ventilating. Rather than if you have a large office, open plan office, you don't need to cool that entire space to combat the heat output of that equipment if it's in its own dedicated smaller room. And similarly, server rooms, it's really common to have servers in a dedicated room, but it's not, and it's extremely common to have a dedicated air conditioning system for that server. But it's not always necessary. It's really common to have the air in those spaces cooled down to the temperature of like a beer cellar, like 10, 11 degrees, and that's way, way beyond what is needed to ensure proper performance of the server equipment. Most of that kind of equipment runs happily at sort of 20 to 25 degrees, and there's very little improvement to be had by cooling the space any lower than that. And so for certainly for most of the year, just using some natural ventilation into that server room is more than adequate. And even if you do need some air conditioning in that space, it doesn't need setting down anywhere below normal room temperature. Again, similarly to ventilation systems or HVAC in general, ensuring that they have been properly maintained, regularly maintained, is key to their efficiency. So where you do need air conditioning, make the most of it and make sure it's properly maintained. Often, again, similarly to mechanical ventilation systems, the outdoor units in particular are nearly always installed high up on a wall or on a roof somewhere. And so they're usually completely out of sight of most people in the building. And so they'll get forgotten about if there's not a regular maintenance program in place. And it's kind of assumed that it'll just continue to work forever without any intervention by anyone. But again, they have air conditioning units have heat exchangers with these aluminium fins all over them, and they'll get a buildup of dirt and dust and even things like weeds will grow up around them. Birds may build nests next to them. They will gather dirt and dust really quickly, and if they're not properly cleaned and maintained, the efficiency of them will drop off a cliff. So getting somebody to look at them at least once a year is really important. And also to make sure that the refrigerant pipework that carries the cooled refrigerant into the building, making sure that that is properly insulated and that the lagging around it hasn't deteriorated or been chewed by rats or pecked by birds. That'll have a really high impact on the performance of the system. There's actually a law in the UK to make sure that air conditioning systems are assessed for their energy efficiency. So any building with more than 12 kilowatts of comfort cooling is required by law to have what's called a TM44 air conditioning survey carried out at least once every 5 years. And that should catch things like maintenance issues on the outdoor units, but also comment generally on the overall energy efficiency of the system. And so at the very least, getting that done should pick up on any sort of major inefficiencies of the system. But it doesn't take the place of regular annual maintenance, but it is a useful document to get done, apart from the fact that you have to do it. Very briefly, HVAC systems often have dedicated plant rooms in big commercial buildings, and there's usually a panel that looks like this in those plant rooms. Something that most people who aren't responsible for these systems would never go anywhere near. Quite reasonably, they are not to be sort of tampered with without knowing what you're doing, but there are some simple checks that anyone can do to make sure that they're operating as they're supposed to. And even if you don't want to press any buttons or switch anything on or off, if somebody checks them, then at least questions can be raised to the people who are responsible for them. This picture is a good example. So it's a simple boiler controller panel. It just basically shows if a boiler is off or on, or if there's a fault. But you can see the selector switches down the bottom. There's settings of hand, off, or auto, and they're all set to hand, and that means that they're just manually all switched on all the time, whereas they should all be set to auto. If they're on auto, then the time programs and temperature settings can be used to switch the boiler on and off as appropriate, but in hand mode, they're just on. And so the energy saving controls of the system have been completely sidestepped in this case, and so the system is just wasting a huge amount of energy. So if you do happen to find one of these panels and you find anything that is switched to hand mode or manual mode or something, then at the very least, try and ask whoever's responsible for running those systems why it's set that way, and if anything can be done to make it work in the way it was designed in auto mode. Again, you can see there's a line of fault lamps here. There's very often what's called a lamp test switch or button on these panels, and if you switch that on, it will illuminate all the lights on the panel, and any lights that don't work won't light up, and that can show if there's any potential for faults not to be identified if the light's not working. If a system isn't working, say a ventilation system has a blocked filter, there would be a fault lamp, and if the fault lamp doesn't work, then you'll never know. So that's another thing that you can test without kind of changing any controls or settings. It doesn't have any effect on the rest of the system. So this next few slides is about compressed air. It's something that will be really familiar to anyone that works in a factory or engineering environment, much less so for anyone that works more in a sort of office or retail environment. But it's such a big, significant use of energy in those industrial environments that it's worth talking about for anyone that does have some sort of involvement in those sort of sectors. So the main reason they're worth talking about is that they're incredibly inefficient. Just the very nature of compressing air means that there's a lot of heat generated. So they're in most cases they're only about 10 or 12% efficient. In other words, 10 or 12% of the energy used goes into actually creating compressed air, and the rest of it is wasted as heat. So the less I'm sure you can appreciate, the less you need to use a compressor, the better, because they're always wasting a lot of energy whenever they're in use. And very often a compressor, particularly in somewhere like a factory, there's usually a sort of a main compressor that is then used to distribute compressed air around the site by a system of pipes. And so they're also so widely used that they're switched on and they run all the time, potentially 24/7. And so they're usually the one piece of equipment that uses the most energy in a factory sort of environment. And also in those sort of environments, particularly in manufacturing and engineering, there's a lot of dust and dirt, oil, grease, all kinds of horrible things in the atmosphere. And compressors don't like any of that. They like clean air. That, as you can imagine, because they push air through them and compress it. If there's dirt in there, then it could upset the whole system. So there's usually air filters to make sure that the air is clean before it goes into the compressor, but those will eventually block, similar to the ventilation systems we were talking about. And blockages will make it a bad problem even worse. So if you're only going to get at best 12% efficiency out of it, just imagine how much worse it is when the air isn't allowed to properly get into the system in the first place. The ongoing air distribution system, so the air lines, pipework around a site that takes compressed air from the compressor to the tools and machines that use it, is something that needs to not be ignored as well. It's really common to when we visit a site where there's a compressor, that there's just a deafening hissing sound coming from all sorts of places around the building, and that hissing noise is air that's leaking, compressed air leaking out of either from tools or from pipework or fittings. And usually that doesn't need to be happening, but it's these sort of hissing noises are something that in a noisy factory often will just get ignored. And like we said about having a fresh pair of eyes on site, a fresh pair of ears is really helpful in these situations, because people do over time just become deaf to these kind of leaking noises. But getting somebody that isn't always on site just to have a quick listen, they'll be able to remind people or point out where there is air leaking if it has been ignored. If the environment is so noisy that you can't hear air leaking, there are relatively inexpensive ultrasonic leak detectors, and ultrasound is really directional, and it can be easily picked up by these detectors and can show you in which direction the sound is coming from, so you can actually pinpoint the source of air leakage, and they can be quite effective to find them. But overall, if you want to test for general air leakage in a compressor system, there's something you can do called a no load test, where usually out of hours, where equipment that uses the compressed air isn't running, you allow the compressor and its the pressure storage vessel to continue running to maintain the required pressure level of the overall system. And so if you overnight, for example, if you leave that system maintaining its pressure, measure the energy that's consumed over that period, and any energy that the system uses when there is no actual need for compressed air, that represents air lost due to leakage, because that's the only way that the system pressure is going to drop is through air leaks. And so you can see if there is a problem to address just by seeing how much energy the system is using through those leaks. I'm just going to do a quick quiz question. You've already seen it, in fact, earlier on, but now that you can see the context, we're just going to run a quick poll to see how much you think a fairly modest air leak might cost per year. So if you have for example, a flexible hose with a 3mm split, so pretty small split in the hose, how much do you think that might cost a business on average per year? There'll be a poll coming up in just, if actually I can't see the screen. There, so yep, if you have a go answering that question there. Okay. So yeah, a mixture of responses there. So it's actually, hang on a sec. Yeah, so most people think £1,000 a year. That might have been true a couple of years ago until energy price inflation went through the roof. It's actually closer to £2,000 a year just for that tiny little 3mm split in a pipe. So you can imagine in a factory where there's several of these leaks, just getting a small, almost zero cost repair done. It might even be a case of tightening a pipe fitting. So virtually zero cost to fix these leaks can rapidly amount to thousands of pounds saved each year. And so it's one of these things that seems really small, but it can have a huge impact on the cost of the energy for a business. Yeah, thanks for that. Something that whenever we do a site survey, we love to find air leaks because it's such an easy thing to fix and has such a huge impact. So just a little bit more on compressors. Reducing the overall demand from compressors is the easiest way to save energy. So firstly, it's really common to find that the set point pressure of these things is higher than any of the equipment that uses the compressed air actually needs. If you can reduce the pressure set point from say 8 bar to 7 bar, you'll be saving literally thousands of pounds a year if the compressor's used all the time. So carry out a review of the equipment using compressed air and just make sure that it's not being the compressor isn't set too high for it. Again, the older compressors or smaller compressor systems, they'll have some sort of drain system to get rid of any condensate, any water in the air that's in the pressure vessel. Some older systems, the only way to get rid of that condensate was just to dump all the compressed air out of it. And I've seen sites where people drain the entire compressed air system on a daily basis just to get rid of any water in the system, because water is quite damaging and will corrode the pipes and the pressure vessel over time and could become quite dangerous. So getting rid of the water is important, but modern pressure vessels should have some sort of drain that doesn't require to vent all of the compressed air out. But also, particularly with larger systems, you can get air dryers which take out the humidity in the air before it gets into the pressure vessel. And so it's an important feature, not only for the sort of longevity of the equipment, but also in terms of energy efficiency. So draining the entire system is something to be avoided at all costs, because that's a huge amount of energy that could be getting wasted on a daily basis. Finally, on compressed air tools, particularly things like wrenches and sanders and that sort of stuff, air hand tools in particular, they're really traditional, really common, because they're so powerful and portable, and they're really, really common in factory situations. But because things have come quite a long way with cordless battery-powered tools in recent years, that it might be worth seriously considering not using air tools at all anymore and replacing them with modern cordless battery powered tools, just because they're so much more efficient, probably safer as well. But the if you remember that a compressor that's inherently at best about 12% efficient, once that compressed air gets through the mechanics of the tool and down the air hose, the overall efficiency of it is going to be well below 10%. But compare that to a modern lithium-ion brushless motor powered tool, the efficiency of that could easily be over 80%. And so the energy consumption of it, and also they only use energy exactly when it's needed, as opposed to having a compressor on all the time. So the energy savings from those kind of tools could be absolutely massive if that's what the compressor is used for in any particular site. Coming towards the end of these slides, weirdly, I'm going to talk about where to start now that I'm coming towards the end of this session. But overall, so just some general pointers. Try to take a whole site holistic approach to energy consumption and energy savings, so that you can take a more strategic approach, dealing with things in a way that ensures the overall system is as efficient as possible. In the way that we were talking about with the LED lighting earlier, taking that whole site approach can identify savings that you otherwise might not think of if you look at things in an individual granular sort of way. And so to do that, carry out a site-wide energy audit to identify as many opportunities to save energy as possible before you go about implementing any specific one of them. So you can then identify kind of the low-hanging fruit, the things that are going to have the biggest benefit for the least investment, and start with those, and then work down to the things that are perhaps going to cost more or have a more modest benefit. And develop that kind of holistic strategy across the site, and that should ensure that you spend money more wisely, and reduce the need to spend an awful lot of money early on. And it's also an opportunity to get a realistic idea of the energy savings. And by that I mean it is possible that if you combine certain energy efficiency improvements, the sum total of the savings from them won't necessarily be equal to the individual savings from either one of those measures. So as an example, you might improve the control systems for your lighting. So you could put automatic motion detectors in place. And if you use those with the existing low efficiency lighting, you'll get a certain amount of energy savings from them. But if you also replace those lights with LEDs, the savings due to those controls will be reduced because the energy consumed by lighting whenever it's on is going to be less. So you can't just add up all of the savings of each individual measure to estimate how much energy is going to be saved overall. So it's not all good news, but it's worth understanding that from the outset. Just a few slides to finish this little session on some sort of mistakes and what not to do, a few myths that you might have heard to do with energy efficiency. Got quite a few listed here, but just to get through the slides a bit quicker, just going to touch on a couple of them. I've mentioned things like cooling server rooms, but there's a few things worth mentioning. So firstly, destratification fans, ceiling fans, as you might be more familiar with, particularly in buildings or rooms with a really high ceiling, it's quite common to see fans at the top of them. And people quite often think that switching them on in summer is a good idea because it'll create a breeze in the room and cool people down. But that's the exact opposite reason of why they're usually installed. And they're called destratification fans because that's what they're designed to do. They're designed to prevent hot air from rising and sticking at the top of a building or of a room. Switching the fan on disturbs that layering effect of hot air at the top, cold air at the bottom, and pulls the hot air back down to the sort of ground level and mixes it up. So if there's hot air collecting in a building in summer at the top near the roof, switching those fans on will have the opposite effect on people. It'll actually make it even hotter for them if they switch those fans on. So I've seen that quite often, and it's a bad idea if people want to be cooled down in summer with one of those fans. Just picking another thing out here. Lighting. It's definitely no longer the case that it's better to leave lights switched on rather than switch them off and then on again when somebody leaves a room. It's nearly always going to be the case now that whenever somebody leaves a room, switching the light off will save energy. It doesn't require a great amount of energy to switch them back on again, like it may have done in the past. Finally, just don't assume that if something has been installed professionally or designed professionally, that it is efficient. And similarly, don't assume that service technicians or maintenance engineers are considering energy efficiency when they do their jobs either. A lot of these industries, building services, construction, things like that, they're very, very traditional and conservative and don't take risks very often. And so it's often the case that the way things have been done is the way they will continue to be done. And that might mean that opportunities to save energy that traditionally weren't considered because energy was cheap, they're still not being considered now. So if you do have a concern with regard to energy efficiency, do raise it with the professionals responsible and see if there's anything they can do to improve the situation, and try and encourage them to be a bit more forward thinking. Finally, we don't have time today to talk about user behavior. That's a separate session on its own, really. But it was quite popular, quite common to see energy efficiency campaigns such as the reminders to switch lights off in labels and things next to light switches, next to taps. They've gone out of fashion, and it's a real shame because they do work. There's complex psychological reasoning behind doing some of this sort of stuff, but the fact is that these kind of campaigns do work. And consider just doing simple, virtually zero cost things like putting some awareness posters about energy efficiency around buildings, putting reminders at the point of use for equipment that uses energy, such as near light switches, remind people to close doors to reduce air leakage. Tiny little simple things like that can just nudge staff into a more energy conscious way of behaving. And it's one of those things that's very hard to actually measure the impact of, but it's probably worth doing anyway. Right, I'm just going to show you a few slides of examples of what not to do. Here's some air conditioning units installed outside to avoid causing an unsightly eyesore. They're hidden away in this little sort of alleyway alcove area, but it's one of the worst places they could have been installed for energy efficiency, because there's a ceiling, there's a sort of a outdoor cover above them, which means that the hot air that they're kicking out, they're rejecting heated air or hot air to provide cooling on the other side in the indoor space, and that hot air is just going to be collecting in that area. It's got nowhere to go, and that's going to make the whole system work far less efficiently. They need a good supply of fresh air circulating around them to work properly. They're also blowing at each other, so they're blowing warm air on each other, which is even worse than that sort of stationary warmed air. And they're therefore just they almost couldn't be a worse place to install them outside. The only worst thing would be to install them inside somewhere. Here's another example of something fairly silly. This was a fashion design and retail company that they've created these design offices within what used to be an open plan office space, and you can see the sort of UPVC double glazed partition on the right hand side there. That's behind those partitions are where the design offices are, and this corridor is where all the radiators are from what used to be the open plan office. And so there's, I think, six great big double panel radiators there, blasting away, kicking many kilowatts of heat just to warm that corridor up. And right above them is a load of very leaky single glazed windows. So all of that lovely double glazing on the partitions is providing almost no benefit, and all it's really doing is ensuring that that as much energy as possible is escaping out of the building from the corridor. And funnily enough, at the same site here is another good example of what not to do. So there's this is it's a warehouse where all of the fashion items are sold and dispatched from. Within this space, though, you can see sort of in the middle of the picture, there's a single story concrete block built internal space that's been created. I think it's a photo studio that's inside that. It's got a sort of a flat roof built within the warehouse itself. What they failed to do was think about the lighting, though. So everything else in the warehouse has been left as it was, and if on closer inspection you can see these light fittings that have been highlighted, all they're doing is lighting up the top of the flat roof above that photo studio, and I think they're 400 watts a piece. So there's about we worked out about 3,000 kilowatt hours a year in wasted energy from those two lights that are doing absolutely nothing for the people in the building. And you can imagine that's it's going to be about £1,000 a year that's being wasted just by not considering things like the lighting setup when they built that new space. So generally, decarbonisation, the general approach should be reduce consumption first before jumping into more exciting things like renewable energy. It's the reducing consumption is not something that people get anywhere near as excited about as fancy new equipment like solar panels. But if you want to have the biggest impact for the least capital cost, then this is the way to go. When it comes to the heating or cooling of buildings, take a fabric first approach. So look at draft proofing, insulation, maybe glazing before you think about installing something like a new boiler or a heat pump. And also in general, decide if you really need equipment, if something is actually essential to the business. Are there different ways of providing the same function in a way that doesn't use energy? Much as we considered the air tools versus cordless power tools, there are quite often more modern alternatives that serve the same purpose without using as much energy. So just try and think a bit more laterally about equipment and functions and operations of the business to see if there's another way of doing things that doesn't necessarily have to use energy in the same way as it might have once used energy. So that's the end of the quick wins session. Before we jump into a bit of a review of some renewable energy systems, just an opportunity to see if anyone's got any questions around or comments around any of the slides that we've seen so far. Yes, Steve, thanks for that. Yes, the slides will be available to anyone that wants them after this session. Also, we are going to have there's something called well on our Bring About website. There's going to be various recordings of webinars and that sort of thing available. So you'll either have access to the slides themselves and or a recording of this session. So yeah, you don't need to commit any of this to memory. I wouldn't envy anyone that had to try to keep all of this in mind. So yeah, thanks for that. We'll jump into a bit of a session about. Oops, where are we? Jumped far too far ahead in this. Sorry, here we go. So yeah, renewable energy. We'll do a quick introduction and talk about the various different technologies available, the more common and beneficial ones, at least, for businesses in the UK. You may be familiar with some of this, you may not, but it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of renewable energy systems. So it's not so much quick wins, but at least if you really are sort of interested in installing any renewable energy systems, then having a decent basic background understanding of what it's all about is a really good starting point, so that you know if it's going to, at least in principle, provide you with some benefit or not. So we'll start with the most popular thing, solar photovoltaic energy, PV. It's all the rage for good reason, because it's come down in price so much in recent years. The cost per panel, it did go up a bit. If you with energy price inflation, it was so under demand that the cost of the equipment went through the roof, but it's come back down again now to the point where it's pretty much cheaper than it's ever been. And it's very, very reliable. So and it's something, and it's also something that people kind of have a decent intuitive understanding of. It takes light from the sun, turns it into electricity, job done. So everyone can appreciate that and understands that it's providing effectively free energy from the sun. And most places have some kind of roof space that it might be able to be fitted to. So it can be applied in the vast majority of locations, with a few a few factors that might affect that feasibility, though. So just in sort of simple terms, just some of the jargon around these kind of systems. A solar panel or solar module is the individual unit that is purchased. They're made up of solar cells, which you can see in the bottom left of the picture here. Those are the individual silicon wafers that are assembled together with metallic contacts between them all, that collectively make up the solar module or solar panel. And then a system of a collected set of solar modules, either a rooftop installation or a solar farm, perhaps. They all go together to form what's called a solar array. And you may get a number of individual arrays in any given installation, just depending on the nature of the site and location that they're being installed at. So solar modules, solar PV, when the sun shines on them, they generate electricity, and it's not alternating current that you get out of your power sockets straight away. It comes out as direct current, and it can be pretty high voltage as well. It can be sort of hundreds or thousands of volts coming out of the system, of DC electricity. And before that can be used, it needs to be converted into 230 volt AC power that can be distributed around your building and sent to the grid if there's any extra. And so that DC electricity has to go through what's called an inverter, and that does the job of turning whatever's coming from the PV modules into usable AC current. And it's also, the inverter will also sort of synchronize that with the grid, so it can readily be combined with grid electricity, or so used on site, in combination with electricity from the grid, or sent back out to the grid if there is any excess. Just briefly, there's just some pictures to help you understand. The solar array on a roof there at the top, there's some switch gear to help you safely isolate equipment. But on the bottom right there, that blue unit, that is an example of I think 3-phase inverter. The inverters generally look something like that. A fairly anonymous box on a wall, but that's doing a really important job of making the electricity actually usable. So a few considerations around the performance and feasibility of PV. Firstly, as you might imagine, the power generated depends on the amount of light that's actually hitting the solar modules, and that is going to be impacted by various different factors. Firstly, obviously, if there's any shading on solar modules, that will obviously impact the amount of energy that is being generated. But it's important to know that in a simple standard installation, any module that has any shading on it will actually restrict the power output of the entire array, because it effectively acts as a bottleneck for all the electrons that are flowing around. So avoiding shading of any amount on any individual module can have a huge impact on the overall performance of the system, unless you have some more sophisticated optimization equipment, things like micro inverters or module level optimizers, as they're called. Avoiding shading anyway is a good principle to go by. But also the overall installation specifics, such as the angle, if it's on a roof, the direction the roof is facing, the angle of the roof pitch itself, could be anywhere from from a flat roof all the way to sort of very steeply pitched roof. There's for any given location on the globe, there's actually an optimum angle for solar modules to be tilted at that matches the kind of latitude that you are in on the globe. So around here, I forget what we are, 55 degrees north or something. But an angle around about 40 to 50 degrees is optimum for this part of the world, because it ensures that the sun is at its highest in summer is going to be perpendicular to the modules, and they'll be able to generate the most electricity at that maximum point. But you're not often going to find a roof that's pitched that steeply. Very often, particularly commercial buildings, have a much shallower pitched roof. Factories and warehouses, the roof might only be 5 to 10 degrees. But the actual loss of energy from having them pitched at a much shallower angle is actually fairly modest. And the shallower the angle, the more sort of smooth the generation is over the year and throughout the day, because they're less they're pointing less directionally for one particular time of day and time of year. The shallower pitch they are, the more they'll sort of the more the less of a peak you'll get in generation throughout the day or throughout the year. So, but some slope on them is helpful though, because it allows rain to wash off them and take any dust or dirt buildup with it. So it's called allowing for self-cleaning. So usually that has to be at least around about 10 or 15 degrees of slope to allow rain to wash the modules effectively. If you've got a flat roof, or if you're thinking of installing modules on the ground, they'll need some sort of framing system to support the modules at the required angle. There's various factors to consider in where you do have a flat roof installation. Firstly, the way they're actually installed on the roof. You don't necessarily want to start putting holes in a roof covering. So there's the actual mounting equipment and attachment method that's important to consider. That can be just weighing them down enough so that they can't lift up in the wind, but you might chemically fix them. In other words, use glues or cements to attach them to a roof in ways that don't need you to actually drill through or puncture the roof covering. With flat roof installation, the modules are installed in rows on these frames that hold them at a certain slope. But because the modules are tilted up from the horizontal, they'll cast a shadow when the sun shines on them. And so the steeper the slope of those modules, the more of a shadow they'll cast, and therefore to avoid them casting a shadow on the modules behind them, the rows of modules will need to be spaced further apart. And so you might get more energy overall for a single row of modules tilted at a steeper angle, but the number of rows that you can install in a given space will be reduced to avoid self-shading, as it's called. And so the steeper you put the steeper you pitch the modules on a flat roof, the fewer modules you'll actually be able to install. So that's worth considering. Also, the steeper the angle that they're tilted at, the more the wind is going to catch them, and so there'll be higher loads for any given wind speed on the modules if they're tilted up more steeply from the roof. And also they can be more visible if they're tilted up more steeply. So there's various things to consider there, and important to at least be aware of these things when you're approaching people to specify a system for you. Just to illustrate the effect of the angle of the modules, the sort of the compass direction, as well as the angle of pitch of the roof or the modules, are quite simple Graphical representation here shows the compass direction that the roof is facing in for any given building along the columns on this chart, and then the pitch of the modules down the along the rows, indicated on the left hand side there. So in this part of the world, the optimum is facing due south and modules tilted at 35, 40, 50 degrees. That'll generate the most energy over a year that is possible in that particular location. If as soon as you start turning away from due south, the energy yield will be reduced, and steeper or shallower angle of modules will reduce the output as well. But it's worth noting though that the effect of compass direction is reduced when the modules are tilted less. So for a modest reduction in energy yield, that taking it to its logical conclusion, if the modules are pointing, if they're flat, if they're installed horizontally, there's no effect of compass direction, as you might imagine, because they're not actually pointing anywhere, they're just pointing straight up. But they're still going to generate 84% of their potential over the year, and so there's a perfectly sort of uniform generation, regardless of which direction the sun's pointing at. So yeah, it's useful to realize that the direction it's facing is not the be all and end all, and there's different setups might suit different properties, different activities. So if you use this to think about where the sun's coming from, if you have a business that operates mostly in the evening, it might be worth having the modules pointing west, even though overall it's not going to generate quite as much. At least the energy is going to be used, because it'll be generating more towards in the time of day when the business is actually most active. So some quick pros and cons. Some pros of some sort of positives, some benefits of solar PV is, firstly, they're extremely reliable. You can easily expect a 25-year lifespan out of the equipment, and even at 25 years, modern modules are usually going to still be operating at about 80-85% of their designed performance. So they can be, and there's very little maintenance required to keep them running at that level of performance as well. The actual energy output of modules is pretty easy to predict. There's freely available data on the amount of sunlight available in any location in the world over a year, and so you can quite easily simulate how much energy any given solar system design is going to put out over a year. And so developing a business case for a solar PV system is pretty straightforward in a lot of cases. There's pretty straightforward energy savings to be had. So any kilowatt hour that a solar PV system generates, if you use it on site, that's a kilowatt hour of grid electricity that you don't need. And so there's a pretty straightforward benefit in terms of energy savings from the grid. Even if you do generate more electricity that you can use on site, it's often possible to export any excess to the grid, and you're actually guaranteed to get some amount of money from your energy supplier for anything that you do export, but it is a pretty modest payment, so around 5p, in some cases 7p or even 15p as an extreme case, is the sort of amount that you could get paid per kilowatt hour of electricity that you export to the grid. But if you do compare that to what it might cost or what you might be saving for anything you use on site, which could be around 35p on average, that's the amount that you would otherwise be paying per kilowatt hour from the grid, you can see that it's best to consume as much of that energy on site as possible to get the maximum financial benefit. Other pros, it's a very mature technology now, and the supply chains are very mature. Equipment and installers are very, very commonplace. There's very healthy competition to ensure that you're getting the best price for systems. It's very low technical risk. It's a proven technology, and as I say, the capital costs are at an all-time low now. I mentioned battery storage at the end of that list of pros. In some cases, well, they can be combined with battery storage systems, which might maximize the benefits in terms of the amount of energy you consume on site. But there are some disadvantages, some sort of negative factors to consider. Firstly, the electricity that's consumed or demanded by a site doesn't always match when solar PV is able to generate electricity. So the time of generation does not always match the time that the energy is demanded, and so in other words, solar PV is intermittent, and it's not always possible to perfectly match the availability of the sun with the energy that's needed. So you will ultimately end up exporting some energy at a fairly low financial benefit some of the time, in nearly all cases. Roof structures are not always suitable for the additional weight and wind loading from a solar PV system. So it's always important to have a structural assessment carried out on the roof, and it can be an additional cost, or it could make the whole thing unfeasible if structural upgrades are needed to a roof. There are some planning restrictions on solar PV systems. It's important to check with your local planning department what is and isn't allowable in terms of permitted development, or what you might need to do in terms of a planning application. And one of the sort of the main restrictions these days on the feasibility of a solar PV system is the local electricity grid and its capacity for taking exported electricity from the PV. There aren't very many places now where there's a lot of capacity to spare on the electricity grid in this country. So there's actually a requirement to apply for a connection to the grid for any system above 16 amps per phase. So if you've got a 3-phase electricity supply, basically anything above 11 kilowatts needs you to apply for a connection to the grid for whatever it is that you want to install. And that can take 3 months to get an answer back, and the answer might not be yes, you can do it. It might be no, it's just not happening, or you can do it, but only this reduced size of system is feasible. Or they might say yes, you can do it, but it'll cost you so much money to upgrade the grid in the local area. So you can't assume that a system is going to happen until the grid, the local distribution network operator, which in our area is Northern Power Grid, the system isn't feasible until they've confirmed that you can connect to the grid in that area. The last disadvantage here is actually, I think, no longer the case, but it was until quite recently the case that putting new capital investment into a building such as PV would add to the business rates of that property, which is entirely going against any kind of efforts by the government to encourage the use of renewables. Investing in the building, increasing the business rates, thankfully, I think has been legislated out of the business rates regulations. I'll just very briefly touch on solar thermal. It's something, if you're familiar with going to the Mediterranean, you'll see on almost every rooftop. In the UK, it's far less popular. It can still be pretty effective in providing buildings with hot water, but it can be quite expensive though. So there's a simple diagram here of a solar thermal system. The panels on the roof, they're called collectors. They're sort of like a flat greenhouse in effect. Usually there's a panel of glass through which the sunlight can pass, but then there's a water filled either panel or tube behind that glass that's dark in color to absorb the sunlight and heat up. That then has water flowing through it with some antifreeze in it, which takes the heat away from the collector and puts it into a cylinder, usually to heat up hot water to then be used from taps and showers and that sort of thing. A couple of examples of installations here. There's on the left hand side, there's some roof integrated solar thermal panels. They look pretty similar to solar PV, but these are for hot water. The roof integrated version is installed in a way that is at the same level as the roof tiles, so they don't protrude from the roof surface, much less visible and a bit more subtle in terms of the appearance of them. On the right hand side, those tubes, that's another type of solar collector called an evacuated tube collector. They do the same job, but just arranged it in tube fashion rather than a flat panel. So yeah, in this part of the world, the solar thermal is much less popular than solar PV. Although the systems themselves are pretty efficient compared to solar PV, the cost of the equipment is really high in comparison. In some cases, it might work really well anywhere where there's a really high demand for hot water. Very predictable demand for hot water, especially even through the summer when there's the most sunlight. That's when it might make sense. But in general, because it's so expensive, the energy savings through having a solar thermal system very often don't recover the cost that's initially paid for it over the expected lifespan. So you could be talking 15 or 20 years payback period for that sort of system. Again, there's similar disadvantages that there are from PV, things like needing a structural assessment of the roof, some planning restrictions, and there is actually also more maintenance required of this system. It does require somebody at least annually to check that the system is operating and set up correctly. Again, as I mentioned earlier, with hot water, there are some hygiene implications if it's not properly designed and maintained. Because anywhere where there's hot water being stored, there's a risk of Legionella that needs to be properly understood and avoided in any way possible. So moving on to renewable heating options, specifically we'll talk about heat pumps. I've got a little animation here just to explain how heat pumps work. But this is an example. There's various different types of heat pump. You will have heard the term air source heat pump, and then there's ground source heat pumps and water source heat pumps even. But just to give that, they all work on a very similar principle. They're effectively designed to take heat from one place and move it to another place, but in somewhere during that process, there's a compressor which causes the temperature to increase, and that's sort of key to the whole system being effective, and that's why you can take heat out of somewhere cold like the outdoor air, and provide useful heat in a warmer space, such as inside a building. So the general case here is an example of what is called an air-to-air heat pump. It takes heat from outdoor air and puts it directly into the air inside a building. And I'll just briefly explain how the sort of basic principle of how they work. So there's a heat exchanger outside. Air is blown over the heat exchanger, and on the other side of the heat exchanger is a fluid called a refrigerant, and that's got a low boiling point below the temperature of the outdoor air. And so when the air is passed over that heat exchanger, the refrigerant will evaporate and start flowing around the system. So as it evaporates, it absorbs heat from the outdoor air, and that heat is carried away with that evaporated refrigerant. It then goes through a compressor, and the compressor, we talked about compressors earlier. They the act of compression causes the temperature to increase, which in this case is a good thing. That rise in temperature means that when it goes into when the refrigerant goes into the building, the temperature of that gas is higher than the air temperature surrounding it. So there's then another heat exchanger inside, which allows that high temperature gaseous refrigerant to dump its heat into the air via that heat exchanger. And as it dumps its heat, it condenses back into a liquid. It's still at high pressure though, but it's now cooler. So the high pressure liquid refrigerant continues on its way round to what's called an expansion valve, where it's allowed to depressurize back to the pressure level that it was originally at. So you've now got cold liquid refrigerant that is back round to the start of the loop, ready to absorb heat from the outdoor air again. And it's a continuous loop that keeps going round and round and round. But that's the basic principle of how a heat pump works. And it's the same process as a fridge or a freezer, but it's flipped around so that you're benefiting from the heat output rather than the cold side. So that was an air-to-air heat pump. This is an example of an air-to-water heat pump here. Looks very similar as an outdoor unit. Looks more or less the same as an air conditioning unit, and they're basically the same sort of thing. But in the case of an air-to-water heat pump, the heat exchanger and refrigerant are putting heat into the water that feeds radiators rather than going directly to the air inside a building. That's really the only important difference. The temperature of the water though that comes out of a heat pump, for the system to work efficiently, it's generally considerably lower than you might get from a gas boiler system, for example. And so lower temperature means to give a certain power output to maintain the desired room temperature requires a much larger amount or size of heat emitters. So if you've got radiators, you might need to double the size of the radiators or double the number of them, or use something like underfloor heating where there's a really large heat emitting surface area so that lower temperature can effectively heat the space in a reasonable time. So air to water heat pumps though, so they have considerably there's an important thing to mention about heat pumps in general. Sorry, let's go back to this slide. They so they use electricity to operate, to run the compressor and run the fans. They don't use heat. They don't use electricity directly to heat the room. So so for every kilowatt hour used to operate the system, they tend to shift 3 or 4 kilowatt hours of thermal energy from the outdoor air to the indoor air, and that ratio of 1 kilowatt hour of energy used to 4 kilowatt hours of heat, that's called its coefficient of performance, and that's the key to their efficiency compared to something like direct electric heating. So if you're replacing direct electric heating with a heat pump, your energy consumption will go down by that coefficient of performance ratio. So it'll be a third or a quarter of your energy consumption, and similarly, the greenhouse gas emissions will go down by that sort of ratio. If you are, however, replacing something like a gas boiler system with a heat pump, the carbon emissions will go down a lot, but the cost of running it may not go down as much because gas is typically much cheaper per kilowatt hour than electricity, and it's quite likely that gas could be only a third of the cost of electricity. So if you only need a third of the kilowatt hours, but it's electricity, it's going to be about the same price as using 3 times the number of kilowatt hours, but of gas. And so the cost benefit, if you're replacing an efficient gas boiler system, might be a bit marginal at the moment. So Yeah, the heat pumps, if you keep them simple, air to water heat pumps can be very reliable. The key is simplicity, though. If you try and introduce other sources of heating, like introduce a boiler system, if you try and get it to do fancy things with hot water as well, or have other features that make it more complicated, that's when heat pumps do become a bit less reliable and hard to understand. But the technology is very well proven. There's quite a bit of negativity around them in the UK, but they've been proven for decades elsewhere in the world, particularly in Europe, where the industry is very, very mature, um, and they do work if designed and installed properly. Disadvantages, otherwise the outdoor units do make some noise. They're nowhere near as bad as they used to be, but if you're familiar with outdoor air conditioning units and the noise they make, it's something that should be taken into consideration, especially if you do have neighbours that are nearby that might find that to be a nuisance. Again, the need to install equipment on the outside of a building means there might be some planning constraints. Either local sort of conservation areas might limit what you're able to do to the outside of a building, for example. And the system is far more sensitive to being sized appropriately than traditional boiler systems. Boilers are able to be turned down quite significantly below their maximum output, whereas heat pumps don't operate very efficiently if they're forced to operate much below their designed output. So so it's more important to design them properly and design them well. Again, we talked about PV and how the local electricity grid might limit what can be installed. If you switch from gas to electricity, suddenly your heating is going to be putting more demand on the local electricity grid, and so in some cases there might be restrictions on how much more electricity you can actually take from the grid to run a heat pump system like that. Hopefully that is going to get improved over coming years as the grid gets upgraded. Air-to-air heat pumps, the diagram, the animation that we showed, that was an example of an air-to-air heat pump. Basically, it's an air conditioning system, but when we say air-to-air heat pump, we're talking about the provision of heating rather than cooling into a space, but they're basically exactly the same thing. And modern air conditioning systems can run in heating mode or in cooling mode. So you're probably familiar with what the indoor air conditioning units look like, but here's a couple of examples: a ceiling mounted one and a wall mounted unit. Then it's a common misconception with these sort of systems that in most cases they're not bringing air into the building from outside. There's no ventilation function of them. All they're doing is blowing air over a heat exchanger, so taking air in from the room and blowing it back out again, but warmer or cooler depending on how the system's operating. Similar pros and cons to air to water heat pumps. They are usually slightly more efficient than air to water heat pumps because there isn't that extra stage of having to put the heat into water. You're just directly putting it into the air. So they're a bit simpler and a bit more efficient. Again, the running costs, though, similar considerations to do with whether you're replacing direct electric heating or replacing gas heating. The cost savings might be extremely modest if you're replacing a gas heating system with air to air heat pumps. They're usually very simple. It's just an outdoor unit connected to an indoor unit via some refrigerant pipework. So they can be installed in a multitude of different situations. And the other benefit is, of course, that they can provide comfort cooling in the summer as well as heating in the winter. The air-to-air heat pumps, as you might imagine, the cost of an indoor heat pump unit is much higher than the cost of a radiator. So buildings with lots of individual rooms that might need lots and lots of individual indoor units could get very expensive. So it might be worth in those situations to consider an air-to-water heat pump instead. yeah, otherwise similar considerations to bear in mind as with the air to water systems. Finally, ground source heat pumps. They used to be people used to get quite excited by them a decade or so ago, because they traditionally have a higher coefficient of performance than air source heat pumps, because the ground temperature is much more stable and the heat exchange is more effective. So they traditionally have quite a high benefit in terms of the energy efficiency, but these days, compared to modern air source heat pumps, there's not that huge a difference, but the cost difference is massive. A ground source heat pump, because the equipment, as you can see here, it's quite sizable equipment that's used. You have to either dig up a large area of ground to put in the pipework that collects the heat, or you have to drill vertical boreholes, which are very, very expensive, thousands of pounds per hole. The overall cost of a ground source heat pump is very, very high, especially compared to air source heat pumps. For only a sort of a modest gain in performance. So otherwise, because it is, at the end of the day, it's another kind of heat pump. So some of the benefits are the same as with the other forms of heat pumps, such as lower greenhouse gas emissions, lower operating costs, especially compared to electrical heating. Very reliable systems, as long as they're kept simple, once again. But yeah, the other similar disadvantages as well, but the major one is how expensive they are, particularly due to the groundworks that are required. And hence they're, in this country in particular, they're really not very popular unless it's done on a big scale. But yeah, so that kind of that really is it, and that's a quick whistle stop tour of renewable energy systems, just to give you in a bit of a base level of knowledge if you are considering any of these large capital projects. Doing it properly is the quick win in this situation. If you're committed to installing some renewable energy, just being armed with a bit of knowledge is the way to do it properly and the way to get the most out of it. So yes, that's the end of the slides, and just wondering if anyone's got any questions before we close. We've got 10 minutes before we're committed to finishing, but thanks very much for listening. I do appreciate it's been quite a long session with a lot of information to take on board, but yeah, if you do have any questions, if there's anything that you'd like to know, then please do ask. As part of the project that you've enrolled in, it is possible to have subsequent consultations with us, so that there is other support available. If there's anything that's sort of piqued your interest, if you'd like to know more, then just do inquire after this session and would be happy to advise. But doesn't look like we've got any further questions though. So thanks very much for sticking with us through this. I know it's a long session with a lot of info, so hopefully you managed to get something out of it at the very least. And yeah, looking forward to supporting you throughout the rest of the project though. Great. Okay, we'll depart then, but thanks very much again, and see you again soon.